Sheila Baber, who is an expert in remote sensing applied to agriculture, and she worked with the NASA Harvest, and she's also a PhD student at the University of Maryland in geographical science. So thank you, Sheila, for accepting to join us, and the floor is for you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Always a pleasure. And I think this is a great segue as well. It mentioned from the drought presentation that was given by Marcus, and then I'll be talking to you. I'm in no way an expert in, oh, sorry, I think I shared the wrong screen. This is my presentation. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we do.
Great. Fantastic. So today I'll be talking to you about irrigation detection using remote sensing. And I mean, Elda asked the question about whether organizations can help governments and smallholder farmers set up irrigation systems. And one way, I mean, their irrigation looks very different in different parts of the world, and irrigation can be used for different means. Irrigation is a significant process in the earth water cycle. I think there is an estimate that 70% of human freshwater withdrawals is used for irrigation. Irrigation can expand the areas that can be cultivated. We see an expansion in irrigation in desert-like areas, in semi-arid environments that might not have supported intensive agriculture before, but now is enabled by irrigation. It mitigates the effects of droughts. If there is it's like an insurance policy. You set up an irrigation system, invest in an irrigation system, and if there's a drought, then potentially the irrigation system could ensure that there are fewer losses for the farmer. And then it can be used as a yield increasing measure in areas that are limited by rainfall. So I already mentioned the 70% of human freshwater statistic that was made in 2017. Area under irrigation is expanding, particularly in water-stressed locations. The figure on the right, it was a study that was conducted in 2024 that documented expanding irrigation, particularly in areas where the freshwater, the surface water, and the groundwater supply was not enough to meet the stable water level when irrigation is taking place. So that's the paper worth checking out if you're interested in how irrigation is affecting the global water usage. And then at the same time, while irrigation is a significant factor in agriculture and water supplies, national irrigation statistics is somewhat outdated. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations collects national irrigation statistics, but some of these might be decades old, depending on the governance structure of the countries in question. So Earth observation has a role to play, has a potential role to play in the irrigation landscape, and that can be used to monitor how much irrigation there is and potentially how much water is being used and what types of crops are driving irrigation expansion. So as mentioned, irrigation looks different across the world. We can have paddy systems to grow rice or other pretty water-intensive crops, as shown here in Pakistan. This is a pretty, coming from Asia, like paddy systems are pretty familiar to me, but you can also have pivot systems like this in Saudi Arabia, where there is a rotating sprinkler that goes around usually large fields, and this can be seen from airplanes and can be seen from satellite. Or you could have more traditional ways of irrigating crops, such as furrow systems that use gravity and has, oh, I see that there's an annotation by Peter, maybe by accident. And this can be seen in Ethiopia on the right. So irrigation can look different in different parts of the world, and that can be a challenge when using remote sensing to identify irrigation. I also want to let you know, I don't know if there's a way for me to get rid of the annotation, actually. There we go. So the statistics that are gathered by the FAO or by the government might refer to area equipped for irrigation, which means that, I mean, there are systems that can supply irrigation. There might be canals, there might be irrigation pipes, but it does not always correspond to the actual area that's been irrigated. So one somewhat well-known data set is the Global Map for Irrigation Areas by Siebert et al. 2005 and updated several times since. And that was looking at area equipped for irrigation. And irrigation infrastructure can degrade over time. So maybe there was an irrigation project that was supposed to support hundreds of thousands of hectares. But over time, if there isn't enough maintenance, that area can decrease. The actual irrigation might decrease. I also want to make the caveat that I won't be talking about irrigation quantification. So irrigation is important because it affects the crop, but also how much water is used for agriculture. There are studies, there is a movement to try to quantify the water that is applied to the field. And at the field scale, when looking at specific farms or at a very small region, it is possible to have the ground truth data to calibrate these models to say, oh, in this, there is, I'm not an irrigation expert necessarily, but we could say, oh, so many liters of water were supplied per hectare. And there are studies trying to use soil moisture and precipitation to try to model the sort of water amount that's being supplied by the irrigation system. But that is not what I will be talking to you today. So when detecting irrigation using remote sensing, it's good to look at what are the biophysical characteristics of irrigation. Studies in the past have used greenness like vegetation indices such as NDVI. The problem with NDVI is that it does saturate at high values. So it's good to look at other vegetation indices such as GCVI, which is the Green Chlorophyll Vegetation Index, or EVI, which is the oh my goodness, I forget the acronym, but there are multitudes of vegetation indices that could be used to measure greenness, with the knowledge that irrigated crops tend to be greener than non-irrigated crops. Granted, it depends on the crop type and how late in the growth stage. Evapotranspiration is another important variable to look at. Transpiration is the process by which plants absorb water and then release water into the atmosphere. And that's driven by sunlight, temperature, wind speed, whatnot. And there are ways to model the evapotranspiration, which is the combination of evaporation from the soil and the surroundings and the transpiration, which is from the plants. It is basically the plant water usage, and that can be derived using satellite data as well. Temperature is also another good indicator for monitoring irrigation because planted and watered crops tend to be colder in temperature than dry crops. Soil moisture can also be measured from satellite data, and I think Marcus spoke about that a bit earlier in his previous presentation. Soil moisture data sets tend to be coarser, however, so depending on the scale at which you're looking at the irrigation, whether you're looking at field scale irrigation, or maybe you're looking at country scale or even global scale irrigation, the appropriateness of the soil moisture data needs to be considered. And when looking at irrigation, there are other clues that could also help the modeler detect irrigation, such as homogeneity and texture. Irrigated fields tend to have more filled-in fields than rain-fed fields. It's less patchy. Distance to canals, if there is an intensive irrigation canal system, the distance of the field to the canal probably plays a role in whether that field can be irrigated or not. For really high resolution satellite imagery, you can even see the movement of the pivot system if you're looking at pivot irrigation systems and the seasonality, because irrigation can be used to grow crops even during dry parts of the year. As I'm a PhD student, much of the content that I'll be presenting to you today relates to my own research. So the first case study I want to present to you in using satellites to look at irrigation is using satellites to look at irrigation in Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast of Ukraine. As Leo in the very first presentation today mentioned, a lot of us in the Department of Geographical Sciences working in agriculture have some sort of Ukraine project because Ukraine is a major crop exporter, grower, and the impact of war on agriculture is has been tragic to see, but also fascinating to see. Here, I'm looking at the impact of the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam and the reservoir on the irrigation system of Kherson and Zaporizhia, located in the southeastern part of Ukraine. And you can see the before image of what the reservoir used to look like. The dam is located here, what the reservoir used to look like. And then when the dam got destroyed in June 2023, what the reservoir then looked like and what the impact was on the surrounding agriculture. Irrigation was a big part of agriculture in Kherson and Zaporizhia. As a bit of a context, the irrigation system was built during the 1950s, during the Soviet Union times, and was used to support agriculture in this semi-arid environment in southeastern Ukraine. The Kakhovka Reservoir here used to supply water, drinking water, and using water for 700,000 people and irrigated 260 kilohectares of cropland. The 260 kilohectares of cropland was based on satellite analysis by me, but there was a time when this irrigation system could support close to 500 kilohectares of agriculture. And this is an inset showing you where the oblasts are. And this is a zoom in using PlanetScope imagery. That's 3-meter resolution commercial imagery from Planet, showing you what the surrounding fields used to look like near the dam before the war, and then what it looked like the same time of the year after the destruction of the dam. So you can see that these fields look quite different. Because Ukraine is an active war zone, training the model to detect irrigation meant using an unsupervised. For me, I used an unsupervised model. I used the input features that I talked about before, the vegetation indices to measure greenness, the moisture index using different parts of the band, thermal data from Landsat, evapotranspiration data from FAO, precipitation data from the CHIRPS data set, and then I constrained my search area for irrigation within cropland designated by the European Space Agency. I use the k-means clustering approach for looking at irrigation. So a k-means clustering approach is an unsupervised approach. It looks at areas that are similar in characteristics and then groups them into different characteristics. And I was experimenting, no need to get too deep into the technical details until the Q&A, but I then manually labeled each of the clusters and based on my understanding of what irrigation looks like, and I did have some ground truth in other parts of Ukraine, but not in Kherson and Zaporizhia, to then label the clusters as irrigated versus non-irrigated. So that was the unsupervised portion for the years 2019 to 2022 before the destruction of the dam. After the destruction of the dam, I trained a new model using the multi-year unsupervised maps from the previous years using the same input features. And then this time I used a supervised model to then get at irrigation for the years 2023 and 2024 when there was an interruption in the irrigation system due to the destruction of the reservoir. So here are visualizations of the resulting irrigation maps. In cyan color is irrigated, and you can see that between 2019 to 2021, it's pretty consistent. It's about the same amount of irrigation. 2022, there's a slight decrease in irrigation, and that's when the war started. And you can even see where the front lines are because of the dark coloring of the fields. And then in 2023, you can see that the reservoir drained and the reduction in irrigation, and in 2024, much less irrigation than in previous years. But this is a preliminary result in getting at the area of irrigation. Leo hinted at it earlier in his previous presentation about how maps can inform area estimation. And later in the week, one of our professors, Sergei Skakun, will talk more about how you can't just straight up use maps to calculate areas. There are a sample-based approach to make sure that the biases in the models that you used are accounted for, because first one needs to validate these map products and see how accurate they are. Because again, Ukraine is a war zone, validating the quality of the map, assessing the quality of the map, and then deriving the area estimates meant that there was photo interpretation that needed to be done. Photo interpretation is the practice of looking at satellite data and then as a human observer without being there in person, making a decision on whether the phenomena you're mapping is actually present. So for photo interpretation, I looked at GCVI, which is a vegetation index, PlanetScope imagery to look at texture. I looked at land surface temperature available from Landsat 8 and Landsat 9, and I looked at the evapotranspiration data and the precipitation data to see how much water usage there is compared to how much water is being supplied from precipitation, with the understanding that if there's more water usage than is available from rain, there's extra water that needs to be accounted for that could be irrigation. I also had access to greenness time series. So irrigated fields tend to exhibit higher vegetation indices peaks. And you can see that for this particular field in 2020, there was a pretty high GCVI value. And then in consequent years, And during the start of the war, you can see that there wasn't much activity going on. And maybe they planted a winter crop, but in 2023 and 2024, it's pretty flat. So it's pretty bare in the years. Looking at land surface temperature time series, I had access to an experimental data set from Planet using microwave parts of the spectrum to look at land surface temperature. Irrigated fields seem to have this characteristic where temperature goes down from the start of the season to the end of the season. So even though the air temperature might be going up because of summer, because of sunlight, whatnot, there's still a downward trend in the land surface temperature because of the vegetation evapotranspiration. There's just a lot of shade and there's water that's being evapotranspirated. Whereas in years where there might not be crops, the land surface temperature would probably closely follow the air temperature. It gets hot in the summer and then it gets colder when it's autumn. So that was an example of an irrigated field. And then here's an example of a field that wasn't irrigated. Actually, it didn't even really grow crops. You can see, no, it did grow crops, I apologize. So you can see that in years where there was probably irrigation, this is a field that could have experienced irrigation in previous years. I mean, had lower GCVI values. If you look at the temperature, it is a lot warmer than the irrigated pivot fields here. If you look at the GCVI values, you can see that it is pretty dark. And then the evapotranspiration is also lower. And then here's an example of a field that might not have received enough irrigation in 2023 when there was that disruption in irrigation in June because of the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. This field looks green, but if you look at the temperature, it looks a bit warmer than in this situation. And if you look at the time series of the temperature as well, it doesn't have that downward trend that might have been available in previous years. There's actually a bit of an inflection point. Okay, so once I photo interpreted the samples that I was using for area estimation, then I could get at the areas estimated but from the maps. So in previous years, 2019 to 2021, irrigation is pretty consistent in the 200 kilohectares level. In 2022, there was a drop in irrigation, likely caused by the war. Farmers were probably abandoning their fields. In 2023, even less irrigation. And then in 2024, much less irrigation compared to, it's almost a 90% drop in irrigation compared to previous years. And I want to say that the error bars are 95% confidence intervals based on the area estimation approach taken. Once you have that irrigation map, and if you have access to a crop type map, they can combine them to see what sorts of crops are being irrigated and what sort of patterns can you see in terms of farmer action in response to the loss of irrigation. So as NASA Harvest, we have multi-year crop type maps of Ukraine that we've been making since 2022 and also had access to crop type maps from previous years from our partners at the European Space Agency and our local lab partners as well. So here I'm visualizing the winter cereal crops, which can be wheat or barley, rapeseed, which is another winter crop, summer crops such as maize, sunflower, soy, what have you. And then I only cut out the fields that were irrigated for that year. So this is a 2021 irrigated crop type map. And this is a zoom in showing you how the pivot makes the fields look circular. If I look at the crop types that are irrigated per year, as in I had both the irrigation map and the crop type map for that year, and then analyze what kinds of crops were being irrigated, you can see that it's majority summer type crops. There could be double cropping in black. Maize, sunflower are the most likely crops to be irrigated, and not much changes in terms of like when the field is identified as irrigated, the crop types that are being planted there. But if you look at fields that have been equipped for irrigation, as in I have the maximum irrigation extent during this period between 2020 and 2024. These fields are equipped for irrigation, are capable of being irrigated. And I look at the crop type trends there. It's a bit of a switch. So in 2020, 2021, up to 2022, you can see that it's mostly summer crops, such as soy, sunflower, maize, what have you. But in 2023 and 2024, these same fields that were irrigated before are now mostly being used for winter crops such as barley, wheat, And my understanding is that we're seeing a situation where farmers, when faced with the loss of an irrigation system that could support crop growth during the summer, have switched their crop type to winter crops because winter crops need less water, are grown during cooler months, and do not require as much water to be grown. So it's a shift in the crop types that are being cultivated in this situation in a war zone where farmers are confronted with a loss to irrigation. So that was my first case study of looking at irrigation in a war zone where you can't go physically, but trying to see what the impact of this destruction of the reservoir was. And my second case study is a bit more work in progress. And it's about looking at irrigation expansion in Ethiopia. And I think we have some audience members who are from Ethiopia, and I would love to have a conversation with you because I'm not from Ethiopia and would love to get that contextual information if you're willing to share. So using Earth observation data to study irrigation expansion in Ethiopia. So there is a drive in Ethiopia to become food self-sufficient, particularly wheat self-sufficient. And I think that's a policy at the ministry level. The prime minister wants Ethiopia to become wheat self-sufficient by a certain year. And a key piece to making that possible is irrigation. And irrigation has been used to grow wheat in traditionally dry parts of the year. So on the left shows you where in Ethiopia wheat is being grown according to the US Department of Agriculture for an agriculture service. And on the right is a crop calendar showing you what parts of the year certain crops are being grown. When we look at wheat, particularly, 85% of wheat is being grown in the highlands and are predominantly rain-fed. But there's also wheat that is being grown in the lowlands, about 15% of the total production. And the USDA pointed out that that is probably because of the irrigation system that's being developed. Ethiopia has different growing seasons than the US does, certainly. There are dry seasons, there are short rainy seasons, longer rainy seasons, and the irrigated lowland season roughly corresponds to the Bega season of the year. And I do apologize if I'm not pronouncing that properly. There have been previous studies that looked at irrigation in Ethiopia. There was a study done by the International Water Management Institute, part of the CGIAR network, that was looking at irrigation in Ethiopia for 2015 to 2016. And their approach was to look at the seasonality of the crops being grown. They noticed that there are wet seasons where there is enough precipitation, but if there is crop growth, and in the NDVI curve is shown here in the green, then that might correspond to irrigation because the irrigation can then support the crop growth outside of the rainy season. From their analysis, they found that the total area of cropland in Ethiopia was 21.8 million hectares, which is quite a lot of agriculture. And then of that, irrigated area is 1,000 hectares. Sorry, 5% of the estimated total agriculture area. And their map was available publicly. So similar to what I did with the Ukraine study, I took the irrigation map that was made by the IWMI and then did multi-year and then constrained my search area to within cropland. And I used Potapov et al. 2021 to mask out non-cropland areas. And green is the cropland area in Ethiopia. And then I did the multi-year training looking at a point that was classified as irrigated in 2015, and then using the input features of thermal data from Landsat, elevation data to distinguish between lowland and highland, the evapotranspiration data, the precipitation data, the vegetation indices, and the harmonic coefficients of GCDI. And the harmonic coefficients relate to how many peaks are available in a given time. If you take a sinusoidal curve, you can break down like how many sines and cosines might have been this does get a bit technical, but it relates to the shape of the curve essentially. And then I used a random forest model, assuming that a crop irrigated in 2015, 2016 is likely to be irrigated year after year, and then getting at intermediate irrigation maps here for 2020 to 2024. So these are very preliminary results that have not been validated, showing what the area could have been that was irrigated in the Bega seasons between 2020 to 2024. I did not, in this instance, use a sample-based approach for area estimation, so I would not take these area estimates to be final. But it's pretty consistent from year to year, about 300 kilo hectares or so. And then when we compare it to the work done by the International Water Management Institute, it's clear that my maps are underestimates compared to the IWMI maps, with the understanding that I only looked at a specific part of the season, the Bega season, which is when the irrigated lowland wheat is being grown, whereas IWMI looked at the entire year. So there are some discrepancies that need to be ironed out here. And the point being is, it is humbling as a researcher to do research in locations that I'm not from. And it would be really helpful to use this opportunity. Thank you, Walid, for this workshop. But for me, I also would love to take this opportunity for it to be a two-way information exchange, to learn more about how to photo interpret irrigation. For the Ukraine example, I had access to ground truth in Ukraine. I had many colleagues from Ukraine who could talk about irrigation there. But if I'm to do a sample-based approach for area estimation in Ethiopia, then I'd need to be able to photo interpret what irrigation looks like. And that is something that is still a work in progress. So leaving that to the audience members. I want to wrap up this presentation by talking about some of the data sets that were helpful for me when looking at irrigation using Earth observation. The global map of irrigated areas I talked about before. It takes national statistics primarily, and then aggregates them, distributes them to the pixel level. And they've been updated a few times before, most recently by Nagaraj et al. And they used more satellite-based approaches to look at the irrigation distribution. So I definitely recommend you checking that out. For evapotranspiration, the FAO has curated quite a few data sets relating to irrigation. Evapotranspiration is available from FAO at decadal, as in 10-day intervals. They're also available at monthly intervals. I think for the Africa, Northern Africa, Middle East region, and Sub-Saharan Africa, they have data sets that go down, I believe at 30-meter resolution. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But that is a data set that's also useful to monitor irrigation because it's a measurement of how much water is being used and utilized by the plant. The World Cereals data set, which is produced by the European Space Agency and their partner Vito, also has a global irrigation layer at 10-meter resolution. It is only available for 2021 and has been discontinued since then, but can give you a general understanding of where irrigation might be found. And they do have a good description of the methods they use to derive irrigation globally. If you're looking for ground truth data sets to train a model, particularly in industrial settings, the Joint Research Center of Europe has a not annual, but multi-year surveys of crop types and agriculture in Europe called Lucas. And Lucas has ground truths from across Europe, including the irrigation status of each crop. So I think I filtered out the crops that were being irrigated for 2022. And this is the distribution. And it's available on Google Earth Engine as well for easy access if that's the platform that you're using. Some limitations that are worth mentioning when using Earth observation to identify irrigation include that irrigation ground truths are still limited. This data set is available for Europe. There are also data sets for places like the US, but outside of those settings, it's very limited. And if you want to derive area from the maps that you're doing, being able to sample the points in a way that accounts for bias, and then photo interpreting those points requires you to be familiar with what irrigation looks like in the place that you're studying. For me, as a researcher, I have not been to Ethiopia, so photo interpreting is still something I need to work on when deriving areas. Irrigation in temperate zones with high precipitation are harder to identify. Irrigation in arid zones are pretty noticeable because it's green and the rest of the area is not green. If you're working in a temperate zone where there might be enough rain to support rain-fed agriculture, distinguishing between irrigated agriculture and rain-fed agriculture might be more difficult. It might be more subtle. Irrigation quantification is needed for better water usage characterization. There's one thing to estimate the area of land that's being irrigated, but the amount of water that's being poured onto those fields also needs to be quantified, especially in areas that are water stressed, might be moving towards more water monitoring. And that is still a work in progress. But I do have references if you're interested in finding out more about how to measure how much water is being irrigated. Again, your feedback and suggestions are much appreciated as I'm a PhD student, still working on my research. And with that, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Sheila, so much. That was great. I mean, I know what you're doing, but now I'm learning more. I mean, every day. That's super cool. I want to say that we will share the recording and the contact of all participants. So we will share the contact of Sheila, and as I see a comment coming, I'm like asking to connect. And as she mentioned, I think she will love to connect with people, especially from Ethiopia. Yeah. So yeah, we open the floor for the questions. Yeah, Molly.
Can I start? Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Sheila. So
Hi.
I'm going to introduce you to Wubet Alamu, who works with Christopher Nye at the Goddard Space Flight Center. Wubet has been funded along with Waleed's former advisor, Jessica McCarty, in a project funded by NASA through the Interdisciplinary Sciences Program to map all the fields in Ethiopia. So he has all those sort of fields. Also, I would say that Google research is just about to come out with all the boundaries across all of Africa. So those boundary data set will be available soonish. When they are, I will ask Wally to send out a blaster to everyone on this call. So, because we should all play with them, look at them, because I think it would be very helpful for you not to have to find where the fields are and the irrigation, but merely if a particular area has been irrigated or not, right? But I think you and Wubet will have a lot to talk about, and he's local to you. Finally, I'm really interested in bringing back some of the ideas from Marcus's talk, where he was talking about the impact of drought. And one of the most fascinating things he said at the end of his question period was the data is actually not about estimating the impact of drought, but to get information which would allow us to intervene before the impact has happened, right? And so your method that you've been exploring in the idea of trying to find out where places with insufficient irrigation or previously irrigation could also be applied in Ethiopia to identify places that have that problem, because Ethiopia has been significantly affected by changes in the dams along the river. I don't know what they call it, but they call that river, the big river that goes through Ethiopia. I don't know what
The
that river is
Nile?
called in Ethiopia, but it's
Oh,
called,
the Awash River.
yes, Alash River, right, thank you. Because the river name changes depending on where you are. But so the river has been dammed upstream and is therefore really, and the amount of water falling and et cetera, they have significant availability issues as well as issues having to do with application, if you see what I'm saying. So those are sort of socioeconomic drivers that could
Yeah.
affect. So that's why the 2015-16 data may not be very relevant, because those places may no longer be irrigated because there's no water to irrigate them with, right?
Yes, that is important context. Thank you. Yeah, I think the fact that we didn't have ground truth data to train our models meant using whatever was available. But I think it was a pretty broad-handed way to train the model using data from 2015, 2016, especially if has been a change in hydrology with the dams. And thank you for the offer to connect. So I'm seeing some questions in the chat. There was a question of why I use GCVI compared to other vegetation indices. And I did use other vegetation indices as well, including EVI and whatnot. NDVI has been around for a long time, and NDVI will probably be used for a very long time. But the problem with NDVI is that it saturates at high values. So if a crop is irrigated and is doing very, very well, it might not be differentiable from a crop that's doing okay enough, because at high values, they look similar. I think near 1, they just start to saturate. Whereas in GCVI, which goes up to who knows what, you could see that change in the curve. There's a value of 20, a value of 10, and that's more separatable than NDVI, which saturates at high values. There was also a question that asked whether the random forest model can be used all over the world, or whether it can be only used in the same countries where model was trained. So the thing about machine learning, and Leo in his earlier presentation this morning talked about this, when training a machine learning model, the model depends heavily on the sort of data it was trained on. So if I train the model in Ukraine, then that model will probably be applicable in regions that are specific to Ukraine. There are efforts to make models that can be transferred across geographic regions, but in my particular case, the random forest I trained on, pretty local context. Although similar models using similar approaches probably could be trained in other locations, and it would be interesting to see the performance of this model in other locations. But random forest isn't a model that transfers well across geographic boundaries. So I would probably leave it at that. But you could use similar input variables like evapotranspiration, temperature, elevation in your context. The next question was about the air propagation of, okay, so the question from Elda is, when I used the example irrigation map previously made to construct the training polygons for my classifier, how did I estimate the propagation of the uncertainty of the previous map's labels to my classifier map? And I don't know if Elda's referring to the Ethiopia case or the Ukraine case, but there's a way to, I mean, yes, error is propagated for sure. I think when there is messy training data, you get a messy model. But if I'm doing area estimation, which is deriving a statistic from the map is an intermediate product. And the area estimation is then using the map to derive samples. And the samples are distributed in a way where the model performs well, where the model performs poorly, they're taken into account in your area estimation. And so the results should account for those biases. But definitely, Elda, if I'm using previous years, like IWMI maps for 2015, 2016 to train my models, what Molly mentioned, saying there's been a change in the context where the fields that were irrigated before might not be irrigated anymore, that would affect the model for sure.
So just a little bit follow up, Sheila. If I understood correctly, the labels for irrigated, non-irrigated were derived from previously produced maps, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yeah.
Same.
Yeah. So it's an
proposed
automatically
case
labeling
for Ukraine as well as for Ethiopia, right?
So for Ukraine, I use different maps for each year. So I use the labels for 2019, labels for 2020, labels for 2021. These I made using unsupervised methods. And then I trained a model for 2023 and 2024. So there is a bit of a domain shift where I'm using it for different years. As for Ethiopia, I used the maps that were made in 2015, 2016. And then I assumed that the field that was irrigated in 2015, 2016 would be irrigated in subsequent years, which is not, I mean, yeah,
exactly,
there's room
that's
for
the
improvement
propagation of air that I was saying. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for
okay.
sure,
Okay.
for sure.
I think you have more questions.
Yes, there's a request to look at slide 23 to look at irrigated areas in the world. It only shows only India and Pakistan have large irrigated areas. This map was made, I think, in 2000. So it is definitely outdated. This is in terms of percentage of pixel. So, yeah, so intensity matters here. This is probably rice cultivation that is taking place in India and Pakistan. in one of the very first slides I had shows the expansion since then. And this is a paper by Mehta et al. 2024. You can see there's still a lot of irrigation expansion taking place in Southeast Asia, but also relating that to how much water is available. So Kelechi says, why did I use a soil moisture index instead of soil moisture? Let me double confirm that that is the case. I didn't use soil moisture as an input to my models because the soil moisture data sets I had were too coarse given the field sizes. So the sorts of data sets that are available from SMAP, whatnot, they might be kilometers. Like 1 pixel could be kilometers, could be hundreds of meters, which is larger than looking at the field scale. I was looking at each field basically and trying to figure out whether it is being irrigated. But other studies are attempting to use soil moisture to look at irrigation. I think I mentioned the Dari et al. Paper, and they are trying to look at relative soil moisture according to a baseline, and then they're trying to align that temporally with the precipitation, and then subtracting one from the other to say where is the excess water coming from. So I don't know if that is clarifying your question.
Yeah,
Kelechi.
just as a follow-up also in terms of like the availability of data, like we don't have, as she mentioned, like field level data soil moisture, and we just launched, I mean, NASA and ISRO just launched the NISAR satellite that can give 100 to 200 meter resolution soil moisture, if this will help actually. Yeah.
Kelechi also asked another question. Is there a plan to quantify how much water was used in addition to irrigated area quantification? I mean, absolutely, that needs to be done for there to be proper accountability of water usage. It is outside of the scope of the research that I'm doing, which is using remote sensing to look at area. And evapotranspiration data might not capture all water applied in irrigation. You're right, there is water that could percolate down below the root zone. There is runoff that could happen horizontally. Evapotranspiration is a fraction of the water that was captured by the plant. So I think there's a lot of work, there's a lot of active areas of research when it comes to irrigation and earth observation, because we're now moving beyond just identifying crop versus not crop. This is maize versus this is not maize. Now we're looking at land use. How is this crop being grown? And that is a more, it's an more open area of research, I believe. Mohammed also asks, can we identify irrigated area by this way? Like if ET is higher than precipitation, then it's irrigated. Yes, I mean, that is the assumption that many researchers are making. If there's higher ET than precipitation, that extra water could be coming from irrigation. How about fields that are both irrigated and rain-fed? So Elda, that hints at the limitation that I talked about. In temperate zones where there might be enough water to grow a crop, irrigation might be used to increase yield as opposed to crop survivability. And in that case, quantifying how much water is being used by the plant versus how much water is coming from the rain becomes all the more important because it's hard to tell from an observer, maybe even from someone looking at the maize or the soy or what have you. This is a rain-fed crop versus this is an irrigated crop. So I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done in the quantification side of things for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Sheila, for this comprehensive answers and so much engagement in the work you're doing. And I mean, based on the question, I can say that tomorrow we're gonna tackle some of this while with Arthur Ensley presentation. He will be addressing the GPP approach, where we quantify basically the productivity of the plant rather than looking at like just the biophysical things, but like I mean, evapotranspiration only, we look at the productivity of the plant and the carbon that is was generated from the plant itself. And this is one of the approach that is like now looked at to quantify the use of water or in a biophysical way. And yes, so the recordings, we will get them as soon as possible. The idea is like we want just to cut them, prepare them, and make them available for everyone. And we will send them as soon as possible. And yeah, tomorrow we're gonna be addressing more the area estimation that Leo and Sheila have touched on it, and we're gonna be like how we really do it and how we go like all the steps and what is the error estimation, and then from there, how this area estimation is used for yield estimation, because yield is productivity on area. So we have the area, and now we're gonna see how we're gonna see like how we basically can estimate yield, and we will use two approaches during the day. And yeah, so thank you for being with us, and please don't forget to fill the form to give you more news and the recordings. And yeah, thank you so much, and see you tomorrow. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, everyone.